Good evening, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the special edition here on Hilaal TV as we mark International Workers' Day, a day to remember many of the workers who sacrificed their lives to provide for their respective families. Here in South Africa, of course, we mark it also, but it comes at a time where unemployment continues to be at a record high. As of South Africa's statistics, for the last quarter of the year, unemployment was sitting at 33%. Well, it seems VAT is about to be scrapped, even though there needs to be another budget speech that will need to be tabled on May the 21st. Concerns with regards to potential austerity measures, and where is the country heading in terms of any supposed growth that we would like to see. Let me welcome my panelists. I'd like to introduce Terry Bell, who is a Labour analyst, and Mametlwe Sebei, who is the president of the General and Industrial Workers Union of South Africa. Let me start off with you, Mr. Sebei. We mark Workers' Day, but we mark it at a time where really there's not that much to celebrate, isn't there?
Absolutely. But that said, I think it is important really to also recognize where we come from, particularly on an important occasion like this, because as I've been doing interviews, in the course of this week, people are saying, are unions still relevant and so on? The reality is, despite all the problems, despite all the setbacks, despite all the weaknesses, all the elements basically of the modern civilization that the capitalists are as, if you like, a natural progression of society or inherent values of Western civilization. The fact that in law, at least you're entitled to an 8-hour week, the fact that you're entitled to, holidays, but also there is today public health care, a public education system, there's public housing, and all the major rights that we have in the Constitution in this country, and I think are also recognized in the international law, that makes, if you like, a civilized, workplace and labor system that we have. All of these are heroic conquest of the working class struggle for bitterly over generations, and with sacrifice in terms of blood and human lives and all of the things and so on. That said, of course, you are right. The devastating levels of unemployment, that stand at over 40% if you use an expanded definition. The levels of poverty, which according to UCT researchers, can be estimated as about 2/3 of the population in this country. The growing inequality, the housing backlog that stands at 3.7 million houses, with 13% of the people living in informal settlement, and represent, if you like, the major failure of the system, particularly neo-colonial capitalism and its neoliberal policies, to deliver on the most basic, elementary, fundamental rights that were at the very core of the struggle for democracy that was waged overwhelmingly by the black working class to break the yoke of apartheid, but also the colonial slavery of neo-colonial capitalism in this country.
Mr. Bell, I want to bring you in. We have this constitution. It's there to protect the workers. We've got the various labor acts that are there. But when you see, of course, the mass retrenchments that are happening, and I have to go to, of course, what we saw earlier on this year, Amplats, who had to let go of a number of workers with the closing of the steel mills in the Vereniging area in KwaZulu-Natal. It kind of shows that, I guess, how much of leverage do conglomerates, companies still have within deciding the fate of workers?
Conglomerates and corporations internationally have much more clout today than they ever had before. And Mametlwe Sebei is correct about the unemployment situation here locally. 33% is a nonsense. But even the expanded definition of 40% is a nonsense. Because if you work for 1 hour in a week, you're regarded as employed. And that's ridiculous. We probably have a reality of unemployment in this country of 50%. In some areas, youth unemployment between 15 and 25 is up to 80%. This is catastrophic. But it's not just here. We have a global problem. We have a global problem of massive unemployment, more and more unemployment, and also the clawing back of some of the great gains that have been made in the past. We have a wonderful constitution. Unfortunately, its clauses are never actually fully realized. We don't have the implementation. We are great at putting forward policies. Our politicians are. They don't ever come up with a timeline or implementation of those very, very policies which we should actually put in place. So they keep telling us, they give us, fob us off with all sorts of promises, etc., when we have one of the biggest cabinets in the world, one of the highest paid cabinets in the world as well. But you know, this is at a time when times have changed. And at the same time, we have a largely weakened and fragmented labor movement. And that's not just here, it's globally. You know, in the United States, for example, the world's greatest so-called greatest economy, less than 10% of the workforce is unionized. Our unionization in this country has declined. It's now below 23%. I don't know exactly what it is. I don't think it's been a recent survey. So the future of work, because times have changed, and therefore the future of trade unionism is now uncertain. And the gains of recent years are, even in some regions, the gains of many decades are being clawed back. They're starting to do it here too. Austerity is the name of the game.
Yes.
It's a very, very difficult situation. At the same time, we have the barbarism of Gaza, the horrors of Sudan and the DRC. The so-called liberal consensus that we've been fed with for the last couple of decades, particularly here, is at an end. You know, we've got to. The main sufferers, once again, are the sellers of labor, the working class, whether they're employed or unemployed.
Mametlwe, Mr. Sebei, I want to come to you, and I'm going to touch on, of course, the role of unions in the next segment when we talk of unemployment. But I mean, globally, we're seeing a change. Even the most industrialized economies are going through a number of economic challenges. A number of the unemployment numbers there are growing quite large. We just have to look at, of course, as recent as a few months ago when VW conducted strikes. So it's not just a South African issue, isn't it? When you look at it, when you speak to unions overseas, they themselves are saying the challenges are quite real. And it's probably going to get even darker with, of course, a potential recession, which, if it does hit the United States, could have reverberations across world economies.
Absolutely. I mean, Comrade Teddy Bell is correct. I mean, what we are witnessing on the political plane is a qualitative drift towards the right, characterized by right-wing, populism, authoritarian regimes that are clamping down on the rights won over decades of struggles by the working class. And at the core of all of that is an organic crisis of capitalism, which is, of course, expressing itself at the international level, with wars that you see in Gaza, in Ukraine, because at the core of that war is an inter-imperialist rivalry and struggle, for markets, in the conditions of the economy under grip of overproduction and overcapacity across all the major industries. I mean, take a steel industry as an example of that, right? China alone has an industrial capacity to manufacture 3 times the size of the world market for steel. And that is the reason that there's been dumping in South Africa, which has decimated the steel industry, making, killing the second steel manufacturer, Highfield Steel, that was only, saved by a hostile takeover of ArcelorMittal, which itself has lost over 90% of its value in the past decade or so, and is undergoing massive retrenchments that we are seeing. So the wars that Comrade Ted is speaking about is an expression of that. domestically, the attacks on the working class, not only by authoritarian right-wing regimes like those of Donald Trump, the fact that the attacks on the workers' rights is universal, is speak to the universal and international character of the crisis, both on the part of so-called democratic center-left regimes, in South Africa, for instance, where we are, facing a torrent of anti-labor legislative amendments that want to strip the workers of their rights to a disciplinary inquiry, of union representation, want to expand a ground for dismissals in the case of incapacity, and all these sorts of attacks, in addition to the ones that restricted, the right to strike and so on in 2018 and so on. So the fact that both so-called progressive neoliberal regimes and authoritarian right-wing populist regimes are carrying out more or less the same attacks, it shows that the crisis is rooted in the organic crisis of global capitalism itself. And although the reaction may be dressed in different rhetoric, the reaction and the response is one, is that of a coordinated, all-out capitalist offensive to dismantle the hard-won rights of the working class domestically, but also internationally through, the wars that you see against the oppressed people in Gaza, but also the war in Ukraine itself.
After the break, we're going to hold that thought with regards to just how much of power is given to the employee. That's the question I'm going to be asking Terry Bell after the break. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to the special edition here on Hilaal TV. We are discussing International Workers' Day, and my guests are Terry Bell, Labour Analyst, and the President of the General and Industrial Workers Union of South Africa, Mametlwe Sebei. Mr. Bell, I want to come to you. The word labour, the word employee, has it just become words? How much of it has a human aspect to it? I ask this because if an employer feels that, well, I could just get rid of my employee, it can be done. If there's a necessity for there to be a reduction in the workforce, it can be done. Yes, we have the labor laws, you have the acts, but you've seen in time and time again that those aren't really practiced upon as enshrined in our constitution.
Well, certainly here, and we're talking globally as well, it's happening everywhere. The point is, yes, in the past, employers simply hired and fired at will. Unions got together. The basic thing was worker unity, got together, formed organizations, resisted this, and brought about these changes which allowed workers to have that right. And we have in South Africa some fairly good labor laws. We now have amendments being proposed which are starting to undermine those labor laws. And this is happening around the world as well. And it is interesting, because one thing that was mentioned in the earlier segment that people often forget about is the world has a crisis at the moment, but not, we must remember, of shortages, but of surpluses, surplus steel, surplus cars, surplus production, in fact, even surplus food, at a time when the vast majority, millions of people are starving. In this country alone, 27% of our under fives are stunted. That's a United Nations properly authorized figure. We are destroying, we are wasting the potential of a whole generation, not just in this country, but around the world, because of this very system, which the unions originally grew from in order to resist. Unfortunately, I would argue, I think, that most unions have lost their way. And to various levels, they've become absorbed into the system they were initially formed to oppose.
Okay, that's why I need to bring in Mr. Sebei. Mr. Sebei, have unions lost their way?
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is, if you look at the whole political economic architecture for the management of capitalism in this country, and you can easily extrapolate that to, big parts of the world today, is that without the collaboration of the trade union movement, capitalism wouldn't be able, to last even for years, right? You look at the ANC in government. Without COSATU, without, the civics and others, organizations, mass organizations of the working class that are part of the tripartite alliance, part of the Congress movement, the ANC would have long, been thrown out of power. So it is the role of this organization, not only in keeping the ANC in power through election, mobilizing their working class base, elections after elections, but the very fact that they are very essential, if you like, as lieutenants of capital, in the workplaces, in the industry, collective bargaining councils, in network, in holding down the working class to a framework of organizing and operating the economy that is based on the private ownership, a private ownership that is currently monopolized by few powerful multinationals and the old white capitalist class that continue to ruthlessly enslave the black working class through a system of, a cheap black migrant labor, as well as, of course, displacing a number of industries like mining, for instance, ordinary black working class people through a colonial style land dispossession to make way, for mining in platinum and other new minerals, as well as, of course, maintaining monopoly over the ownership of the land to the exclusion of the vast majority of the population. And at the same time, I think we've got to say this, and I think Comrade Teddy Bear is correct. You see, the crisis in our economy is fundamentally that of the monopolization of the private ownership, right? And monopoly capital doesn't create jobs. That's the fact of the matter. That's the reason year in, year out, they tell you about investment, right? But those investment lead to restructurings at workplace. Clover is one example of that, and many others that I can, tell you about, where, multinational companies came, took over South African corporations, investing billions that led to massive displacement of labor, right? At the same time as closing possibilities of any others and so on. So, and the union is essential, part of that whole political economic architecture. So we need to say unions must break free in the case of COSATU from the alliance to reassert the class and political independence. And that means not only, relying purely on the organization, the unity, and the militants of the working class to defend itself, but actually means organizing itself and other sections of the working class fighting in other theaters of the struggle into a party of the working class for the purpose of seizing both political and economic power on the basis of the Mass Workers' Party, on the basis of a socialist program to bring into public ownership the mines, the banks, the factories, and all the key sectors of the economy, on the basis of the democratic control and management of the working class, so that we can build an economy that is organized to meet the needs of the people, but also that is organized in the interest of everybody, not just a few who have monopolized ownership and are profiting from it, creating the current crisis of unemployment, but also of the cost of living crisis that we face.
Economy to meet the needs of the people. Gentlemen, we've got 3 minutes each, and it's a question for both of you, and I'll start with Mr. Bell on this. Every year on May Day, we hear President Cyril Ramaphosa since he came to ascendancy, and I think it's probably the same could be said for his predecessor, Jacob Zuma. It's been a case of the ANCs doing all they can to alleviate the crisis of unemployment. This year now, it's the government of national unity. It's still sitting at 33%. All the GNU partners say, well, we've got a plan to go ahead and save jobs in this country and create employment in this country. Are the workers still believing in this? Are they still buying into this rhetoric? I start off with you, Mr. Bell.
I don't think so, and I think that's why we're seeing a decline in interest in unions. I also think the use of the idea of a government of national unity was merely a little public relations exercise to try and capitalize on the original government of national unity of 1994. In political science terms, it's not a government of national unity. It is, if you want to use the correct term, a grand coalition with the two biggest parties together in a government. I would prefer to refer to it as a government of notional unity, because it's certainly not very united. And I don't think the majority of workers have fallen for it. I think as more and more austerity measures are brought to bear, there's going to be more and more disillusionment. The problem here is that you have populism rising. You have the poison of nationalism. And this is one of the problems which was mentioned by my other panelists, that you have this whole thing of black unions, white unions. No, there's only one, to use Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe's famous quote, there is only one race, the human race. There is only one class that is the vast majority, and those are the people who sell their labor, the working class. And there is a minority that own and control the means of production, distribution, and exchange. That is a simple reality. And what we need to do, and what workers need to do at every level, is to understand not just our own history, but global history, where it comes from. Where did May Day come from, for example? How did May Day, from the Haymarket martyrs, which were mentioned in the earlier segment, I mean, there were 4 people who were sentenced to death to be hanged on May Day. They were not involved at all. It was a legal lynching. Now, we've seen enough of that around the world. We've seen it in this country as well. But then one of the men, who happened to be a journalist, and I'm very proud of that, August Spies, just as he was about to be hanged, he stood up and he said, they put the rope around his neck, the time will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangled today.
Mr. Bell, I have to stop you there. Mr. Bell, I have to stop there because I have to get Mr. Sebei's comment. I do apologize. Mr. Sebei, we've just got a few minutes. I just want to get your take on that question I asked Mr. Bell.
I mean, just adding to what Comrade Terry is saying, this is a conspiracy, right, of the neoliberal parties, rejected by the overwhelming majority of the working class, banding together for the purpose of carrying out a very brutal austerity program, privatization of public services, and of course, this onslaught on the workers in order to restructure the economy in the interest of the finance capital that is obviously trying to show up the profits in the context of the organic crisis of their own neo-colonial capitalism that has been in economic stagnation for over 15 years now. They have not been able to achieve any meaningful growth, and the only way that they can show up their profits is by facilitating a massive transfer of wealth from the working class by cutting on their conditions of employment, wages, and of course, attacking every right that they have, including a trade union rights, at the same time as imposing austerity on public services, parts on healthcare, education, on social grants, in order that they can be able to ensure that they show up the profitability of the capitalist class, and they are also facilitating that through wide range of policies. Look at the interest rate, policy that continue to impose, poverty upon poverty. That is already at a catastrophic level, and that has enriched the bankers and, of course, the financial capitalists behind the entire capitalist class in this country. And I think this is what this government is about. The working class must organize politically. The working class must take this. We need working class power, revolution, and socialism in this country.
Mr. Sebei, thank you so much. We have to stop it there after the break. Austerity, that's the word that is dominating the economics in this country. We'll speak about that after the break. Welcome back to this Workers' Day panel discussion with Terry Bell and Mametlwe Sebei. Austerity, austerity, austerity. Well, the VAT hike has been scrapped, but government needs to find a new way to bring in revenue into this country. Mr. Sebei, on this one, I'm going to start with you. I read the Giwusa statement, and of course, it speaks on what has happened. The VAT hike is scrapped. Government, more likely than ever, is now moving into this austerity measures. What is Giwusa's overall assessment on the way Treasury has handled this, number one? And of course, the role of Enoch Godongwana, who carries, if not, the most powerful portfolio in this country.
I mean, we opposed VAT increase. It is a regressive tax that basically, seek to offload the burden of the fiscal crisis of this government on the shoulders of the working class. It disproportionately affect the poor, who spend more, on the basic necessities and all the things and so on. Now, that doesn't mean the support for the push of the DA, because behind all this talk about we can cut, we can do all the things and so on, is actually a savage austerity program that they have in store for the working class. They have been clamoring to, go for a full head-on collision with the public servants, and this is very evident in their discourse about how, we have a bloated public service, when every research indicates that, in fact, the ratio of the teacher to learner, the ratio of a nurse, of a doctor, of a dentist to patients in our hospital, in our clinics, and every public servant, that ratio actually has been in decline, it has been worsening, and that is what actually is compromising the quality of service and, and explaining such a crumbling public service, but also a falling standards of living for the working class and so on. Insofar as the technical aspects of it, obviously, it has been a blunder after blunder. Now, people have illusions in court, right? I can tell you that what courts in this instance reflect is a hot breath of working class discontent that was bringing out this question. You know that SAFTU has made, along with other organizations, part of the the VAT was at the core of the demonstration in the May Day, but also the EFF and many other working class organizations, they were raising opposition. Vast layers of society were being galvanized on this. I've learned, I can tell you as a lawyer, right? And I think somebody also who teach law, that, the highest court of the land is a public opinion, and particularly of the capitalist class, right? One thing is that they are scared. The instability, the political instability that is built on that is inherent in the social powder keg that is this country, given the devastating levels of unemployment, of poverty, of rising inequality, of crime, violence, all of these things and so on, the cost of living crisis. It means that they are scared to provoke anything that can rally people. And that's the reason that they've taken the position that they've taken. Reality is because if you think about the law, the process alone, which is what DA want to say, that is the essence of their victory. What passes, for instance, for a passage of the bill by the legislature is always very debatable. I'll give an example. Today, despite the fact that in law, you can't take any decision affecting any person without hearing them. We call it audio ad partem, right? They are amending the law to allow employers to dismiss a worker without a hearing. Right? Just as the Constitutional Court also has allowed in the past Treasury to pull out of the collective agreement properly concluded with the trade unions in the public sector, despite the principle in law of mutual legality that is called the sanctity of contracts. So the courts reflected in the attitude that they were taking in this case, the hot breath of working class discontent that terrifies the elite because they do not know what will be the spark that will send this country into conflagration.
Mr. Bell, when the VAT was scrapped, and that's one of the reasons why I had to bring you on this panel, I was just thinking, what is Mr. Bell going to say? I can already see him or hear him say, this is an almighty mess. The fact that this was done and this allowed Parliament only 2 days to turn this from a legislative perspective. The events we saw last week, Mr. Bell, did I read your mind right in saying this is an almighty mess?
No, you take right now. You already stolen my line. You see, yes, it's a total mess. And the point is that that in the first place is an iniquitous tax. It is a tax that disproportionately affects the poorest of the poor, and that means largely working people. It's a terrible tax. The point is they could have, in the old apartheid era, we hear so much about it. Desmond Tutu, the late Archbishop, said, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we should actually put a special welfare tax on those companies that profited so hugely from the appalling abomination of apartheid. So for a couple of years, they should pay a special tax. That never came about. But in the apartheid era, corporate taxes were up to 48%. They were then 28%, not quite recently, when the government lowered it to 27% because they said it would encourage investment. It encouraged absolutely no investment. Quite honestly, if you are profiting hugely from a mine or whatever, a mining company, you can't just pick it up and stick it in your back pocket and push off. No, you can tax people who are making extraordinary profits out of the labor, out of the resources, the finite resources of this country. You've been ripping it off for years. You have a situation which can be dealt with in other ways. There are other means of tax as well. You can even talk in terms of a transaction tax, so-called Tobin tax. That's another debate entirely on its own. But the point is that there are many other ways. Let's look at who has benefited vastly. Who, if you are paid 10 million rand a year, paid, I'm not saying, or 20 million rand a year, and there are many people who are on that level, why should they not pay much more tax? Why should they stop at 45%? At one stage in Britain, for example, when they were facing a crisis of austerity, and they decided, well, they better also squeeze the rich, they actually put a 99% tax on people above a certain level. That's actually possible. There are all sorts of other possibilities without screwing the working class, which is actually what happens all the time within this sort of government, within this sort of regime, within the which, but let's correct, the system. The capitalist system demands that profit be maximized. That is the sole goal, the sole drive. And anything that is a cost against the profits, and that means labor costs, it means health care, it means anything that looks after the ordinary people at the bottom of the ladder, is a cost on capital. So therefore, we'll have austerity. And austerity means, quite simply, hammering once again the working majority.
Gentlemen, I've got 1 minute each for both of you. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Sebei. How much of a burden on the fiscal debt deficit is austerity going to have? Your minute starts now, Mr. Sebei.
Well, the problem is that, imposing austerity to overcome the fiscal crisis just, creates a vicious cycle. Because remember, part of the reason for the fiscal crisis is the poverty of the working class in this country. The attacks on the living standard, the attacks on the buying power of the working class means less and less of the working class people are able to contribute to fiscals. And when you do that, right, you create even more fiscal crisis, but also the poverty of the working class means there's no incentive for investment that capitalist, the bourgeois government try to attract. Because you have the issue of exploitation to create surplus value. That surplus value must realize, and realization means they must sell their goods and services in the market. That market is the working class. So austerity is only going to aggravate and worsen the very crisis that they seek to resolve, and instead of solving it.
Mr. Bell, your minute starts now.
Well, I'd almost say I'll second that, because the point is, quite honestly, austerity again hammers the working class. It also tends to reduce productivity. It tends to actually drag the economy down and backward. All it does is to try to pay off the debt of loans that you shouldn't have made in the first place in most instances. We could, if we dealt with the corruption alone in this country properly, authoritatively, and cleared it up, we wouldn't have to bother with austerity. But unfortunately we do, and it's going to be a disaster. It will not solve any fiscal crisis whatsoever.
After the break, we wrap up this conversation. South Africa has targeted a 1% GDP growth by the end of 2025. At the start of the year, there was huge exclamation marks. There are now huge question marks to it. Do stay tuned. Welcome back. We are wrapping up this Workers' Day panel discussion. At the start of the year, when Team South Africa went to Davos, the World Economic Forum, they had promised to sell to investors that a 1% GDP growth or even more could be achieved by the end of this year. The times have changed. Uncertainty within the government of national unity, Donald Trump's tariff decisions, and of course South Africa's future when it comes to AGOA. A lot of that may change. I want to come to you, Mr. Sebei. 1% GDP growth. Are we now in a situation where this is a classic question, a classic statement of this is truly a pie in the sky narrative?
What the projection and the ambition, or rather lack of ambitions, of the capitalist class in this country for raising the productive capacity of the economy reflect is not only admission of the crisis, but the fact that they have no solution towards it. Because think about it. 1% economic growth is the highest ambition. And there's no indication that they will even achieve that, by the way. But even if they were, in the country where the population in 2023, it grew by 1.3%, in 2024 by 1.7%, that actually means a real fall in GDP per capita. Is a part, per capita, in the country and so on. So it means that there's less and less goods, and services per increasing number of people in the country and so on. So that is a real fall. So, and I think it is really because they can't find their way out of this crisis. And you're right. Trump's policies has exposed the entire export-orientated strategy, where basically their whole strategy of building an economy was to enslave the working class in this country in order to manufacture products destined for markets in the US, in Europe, and I think increasingly so to China and all of that and so on. Mainly through a colonial extractivism, where the economy is actually about production of minerals and other raw materials from the agricultural sector without any beneficiations and all of that. So you have all of that now unraveling because of the position that Donald Trump has actually created to the a global, if you like, economic architecture that US imperialism itself has contracted over decades, and South African capitalist class fell for it. That crisis is a crisis of their neoliberal policies. Look at the issue of AGOA. When you look at AGOA, right, 87% of the benefits goes to automotive and I think smelters and so on. Now, let's take automotive industry as an example of that. We have a situation wherein this country, already in the automotive industry, is spending approximately 114,000 rand in state subsidies per job in that industry. That is monopolized by the US and their allies. And what AGOA actually entails is that in addition to these subsidies, we will give you a free access to our own companies, to our own markets, that they would be able to deliver products produced on the basis of your ruthlessly exploited colonial labor, right? And to that end, we also want you then to give us access to your market, in industries which actually were South African owned. One industry, by the way, that lost dismally was poultry industry that was responsible for tens of thousands of jobs and livelihoods, because it's kind of industry that you can literally set it on your backyard and so on. So I'm saying that you can take that industry into public ownership, repurpose that industry to ensure that you are engaged in a real manufacturing, not only in a way that means you can defend the current jobs, but actually you can create many more, because what is happening is assembly, but also direct the production towards meeting a massive backlog for public transport in this country, for trains, for trams, for buses and taxis, that we need to ensure a cheap, affordable public transport for many working class people in this country, because of the legacy of the special planning of apartheid. That means transport still cost about 30% of the incomes of the workers.
Mr. Bell, Davos, was that the perfect PR stunt? Or does South Africa still, does government and Treasury still have a plan to go ahead and achieve this 1% growth?
I must admit that I am really annoyed about the constant reference to Davos and the World Economic Forum, as if it's some sort of specialized international institution. It is not. It's a private club of 1,000 of the world's richest, mainly men. You have to have certain billions to be a member. It is really the big corporations, their individuals coming together and pulling in the politicians, business people, etc., and trying to control and manage the system to suit themselves. So Davos, I'm afraid I have no time for whatsoever. However, this 1% growth, I remember, and Mametlwe is completely correct. I mean, this is actually in terms of per capita income and per capita wealth for the country, it's a decline. I remember not too long ago where government was saying we need at least 6% growth in order to be really growing. That wasn't very long ago. Now suddenly they've forgotten about that. And now, hooray, it's going to be 1% growth, we hope. This is a nonsense. It's a total nonsense. But this is a country, let us not forget, that produces a surplus of food. I'll just not get onto minerals or anything like that. Food alone. Yet how many people in this country are starving right now? How many millions of children? 2.7 million of them who don't even have adequate preschool or early care whatsoever. This is the situation we have. And then the government says, oh, we've increased, actually we're looking after, we understand that the foundation is important. Therefore, we're going to create at the very level a proper education for children for the next generation of workers, where we will then have greater growth. So they increase the payment from 17 Rand per head for registered, and that's something another argument, to 24. When you add inflation into that equation, you discover there's no movement whatsoever, that nothing has improved. I'll give a simple thing, because education does really bother me. Do you know, and I think the listeners should know this, that the total budget for primary early education is the early education segment of that budget for all of primary education is only 4.4%. On a national level, it's under 0.5% of the spend for what the government says is the most important sector. Now, they keep doing this. They fob us off with this thing saying, well, yes, it's a bit of belt tightening. The belt tightening is for the working people alone. It's not for the higher-ups. It's not for the wealthy. It's an attempt to try to create a situation where profit levels can be maintained. It's as simple as that. And whether it's 1%, 0.5%, or whatever, the ones who will suffer will not be those who are in the multi-million billionaire class, no matter what their whatever their color or background, and indeed wherever they happen to live. But so many of these people do not even reside here who profit off the wealth of the workers of this country.
Gentlemen, I've got 1.5 minutes for both of you. When it comes to 1st May 2026, surely we can't be having this discussion. But when you look at the trajectory, it's probably going to be the same. Unemployment's going to be high. Austerity measures may even be much bigger than it is. Where are we heading as a country? Final remarks. I start off with you, Mr. Sebei. Your 1.5 minutes begins.
Well, all of these things for us are questions of the struggle of the living forces. I have an absolute faith, and I think my optimism in the working class, their capacity to struggle to resist, as they have done again and again. Not only in 2012, great mine worker strikes, we've seen them, during the fees must fall in the form of the movement in campuses, outsourcing must fall, and in many other countless encounters that speak to the resilience and the determination to struggle, as well as to organize. And I think in that lies the hopes of this country and lies the hopes of humanity, for us to make, not only to turn the tide against the reaction, against the right-wing populism that seek to divide us, scapegoating the migrants and other oppressions of the working class for the crisis of the system, but I think also for the future, a future of working class power, of revolution and of socialism.
Mr. Bell, your 1.5 minutes begins now.
Well, I would certainly hope we wouldn't be having the same conversation, but I have a terrible fear we will. However, I think unions have now to start to realize they have to adapt, to go back to basics, to understand that the basic thing is unity of the working class on a principled level. Unions are not political parties. They unite the working class as a bulwark of resistance against grosser exploitation and support those who will change the situation. I would hope that next year, perhaps, we will see more, because there are already glimmering signs that some unions are beginning to change, and also that new unions, much more democratic unions, are beginning to emerge using the same techniques, the same backgrounds of the earlier democratic unions. And I would hope that we would be able to see more of that by next year. I certainly hope so, because unless there is, it's not a question of adapt or die. I think it's a question of, if the labor movement does not adapt to the realities of the 21st century, humanity is in trouble.
Humanity is in trouble. Mr. Sebei, Mr. Bell, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here on this panel discussion. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
That's Mametlwe Sebei. He's the president of the General and Industrial Workers Union of South Africa. And of course, Terry Bell, a labor analyst. That's all we have for you here. We'll be back with the News in Focus tomorrow. From myself, Fahraaz Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.